Edward Lee.
How are you?
Thank you for coming to see us at Louisiana Eats. We're pretty tickled to have you here in the studio.
Thank you.
And if there is anyone in the whole world who doesn't know who you are, my goodness, I hardly knew what to talk to you about because you have, I think, a total of 5 restaurants.
Yes.
And you've written just your second book now.
Correct.
You have a documentary film. And of course, you got an Emmy nomination for Mind of a Chef. That's fantastic.
Thank you.
I bet your favorite title might be Dad, though, because you've got a 5-year-old at home, too.
I have a beautiful 5-year-old, and she kind of rules my world right now.
Well, how in the world do you go on a 26-city tour when you've got 5 restaurants, a 5-year-old, and everything else?
I've got an amazing wife that holds things down at home. You know, if she's listening, and I love you, and I'm sorry.
Well, I'm thrilled. So you're sorry, I'm thrilled. Let's talk about your sensibilities in your restaurants. A lot of your focus has to do with the intersection of where Korean and Southern food intersect. Where does that happen?
So it's interesting. When I first moved to Louisville, Kentucky, 16 years ago, I was learning a lot about Southern food, right? And I was absorbing all that I could in the different regions and the different foods. And I used to use the word Southern food a lot, right? And now people ask me, about Southern food. And I always say, well, I don't really know what that means anymore. Like, what are you talking about? Because the food of New Orleans is very different from the food of Tennessee. It's very different from the Low Country, which is they're very different from the Delta. And it's just very different from Appalachia and Kentucky. And so I feel like it's actually kind of an open game, and again, I feel like the food of the American South has, contrary to popular opinion, I think it's been very open-ended, and I think it's been very open to influences from all over the world, including Asia. A lot of the spices, that are used, a lot of the curries and the coconut and all that, the pineapple, a lot of this stuff originated from Asia, some of it from the Caribbean, obviously, but a lot of it did originate from outside the U.S., and so I often find what we're going through now in the South is this sort of acceptance of and this realization of the immigrant South, where we're seeing a lot, whether they're Vietnamese here in New Orleans or Middle Easterners or Africans. We're seeing this huge influx of immigration coming in and influencing how we're eating all over again, just as we do every generation. And so to me, it's just kind of natural to sort of blend some of these spices and flavors. And I try not to force anything, but they kind of go together. I mean, the flavors are bold, they're aggressive, they're flavor forward, they like spice, they like acid. And to me, the kind of the melding of the two kind of work.
How did your fascination with Southern food begin? Because you're a first-generation Korean American, correct? And you grew up in Brooklyn, right?
I grew up in Brooklyn, yeah.
So how in the world did you end up with this fascination?
So it's a long story. First of all, I don't know why, but when I was in junior high school in Brooklyn and all my friends were listening to hip-hop, I was listening to Johnny Cash. And I don't know why. It started, I think it started with Folsom Prison Blues. And I don't know, because no one in my family, I have no connection to the South. No one in my family's from here or anything. But I moved down here because of the Kentucky Derby. I think I had a little too much to drink, and I just wound up staying in Louisville for a little bit too long. And I think any inquisitive chef is going to be influenced by his or her surroundings. And I didn't cook Southern food when I first moved down here. I mean, I had a restaurant in Louisville, Kentucky, 610 Magnolia, and I was just sort of cooking some weird Asian Eurocentric food. And I remember the first day I drove by a stand and saw the word sorghum, and I kind of stopped and I said, what is it? And some redneck in Dungarees said, you got to try this because it's made from a sorghum plant. And I tried it and I was like, oh, this is better than honey. So I started using that. And little by little, and then someone introduced me to sort of a locally milled grits. And I was like, wow, this is really good. So I started using that. So little by little, it really happened over a long period of time where I just started using these ingredients. And I rarely did I use them in the traditional way, but I was finding all these ingredients, being influenced by them, and thinking like, man, these are delicious. I remember, getting introduced to Colonel Newsom's country ham for the first time and thinking like, this is better than any prosciutto I've ever had in my life. Like, why am I using prosciutto? So little by little, my pantry changed. And as that happened, and obviously I traveled and was influenced by people. I remember going to a soul food restaurant for the first time. And I always say, like, I remember the first time eating a bowl of collard greens and finding home, It to me, it was like, this is something that was, even though it's not Korean food at all, it felt like it, and it felt like something that was home. And I just remember thinking, like, I could stay here forever and cook. If this is the food of this region, I could be here forever.
I love having this opportunity to look at that food through your eyes, because all of us certainly remember our first ventures into Asian markets and stuff when we're looking at ingredients we've never seen before. And to think of you having that same experience with sorghum and greens, and it's totally translatable. I get it.
It is, and I don't know, listen, I mean, you take something as maybe ubiquitous as, pork ribs, right? I don't know anyone in the world that's not going to like pork ribs. You know what I mean? Or there's no one if you have a palate, there's no one in the whole world that's going to be like, I don't like gumbo. You know what I mean? Like, I do think there are foods that are universally great, right? And maybe frog legs are an acquired taste, but, there are things about Southern food that are just, like fried chicken. Who doesn't like fried chicken? I mean, you can go all over the world, and people just bite into a crackling leg of fried chicken. It's like, it's the best thing ever.
Well, it's not really been that long since you went to Louisville and began this odyssey. And the growth, the success, the expansion, my goodness, 5 restaurants. I loved reading that you are, in ways, using your businesses to directly affect social change. What are you up to with that? Tell me about what inspires you there, and what are you doing and why?
I think whenever someone has a bit of success, part of it is, it's like equal parts talent, equal parts hard work, and equal parts luck. I don't think any of us can truly stand here and say, I was very lucky and I was very fortunate, and there were people that were very good to me. And I'm in a place now where I can sort of see the next generation, and if I can have an influence on that next generation in whatever small way I can, it's kind of my responsibility too, because people helped me when I was a nobody, and so my director, Lindsay of Kasich, I know I always butcher her name, but she and I sat down and said, what can we do? Because we had this nonprofit and we were going to do something with it, and we were kind of debating what to do. And we decided that we wanted to do something for young women chefs, and we wanted them to, I just want to like equal the playing field a little bit. I mean, it's a very male-dominated field. It has been, but it hasn't always been. And we kind of always think of like, oh, it's always been that way, but it really hasn't. It's just recently it has. And I always say, like, if you look at the history of Kentucky food, if you look at the culinary history of Kentucky, from the cookbook writers to the chefs to the people who really put their mark on Kentucky food, they were mostly women. from the food reviewers to the, Ronnie Lundy, who wrote for the CJ for a long, long time. It was really influenced by women. And now we see an industry which is dominated by men. And we just need to equal that playing field a little bit. So we started a mentorship program where young women chefs throughout Kentucky get to mentor with successful women chefs from all over the country. And we give them, it's not just about culinary training, but it's also about building confidence. They get sort of life coach sessions. They get financial training. They get media training. They sort of learn all the ins and outs of what it takes to be a successful chef in this day, in 2018, which is a lot different than it was even when I was a kid. And so it's basically a way for them to get these tools so that when they're ready to step out into the spotlight on their own, they have this path already kind of, groomed for them.
I'm fascinated with that choice of yours because reading your book, reading your new book, which is such a delight, Buttermilk Graffiti, and reading about you, women have definitely been a major influence in your life. Yeah. And in the book, you actually write, everything I know about food I learned from a woman. And Edward, then you go off on this few paragraph sort of soliloquy about some food goddess in your past named Clementine. So tell us about Clementine. The writing was really so beautiful.
Oh, thank you. I think I know she's living in Italy right now. Actually, this is a funny story. It's part of the reason why I'm in Kentucky in the first place. We were together in New York, and after 9/11, she moved to Italy. And I was like, oh, you're going to move to Italy. I'm moving to Kentucky. So it was kind of like a thing. But yeah, I grew up in a family where I had a grandmother, a mother, a sister. And my father, we were together, but he worked mostly, and he wasn't really around that much. So I was just raised by women, and I never thought about it at the time. It was just that's how it was. And I don't know. They obviously I say that with a little bit of hyperbole, but I feel like all the basic tools, the things that I needed. The smells, the touch, the respect for food, the ideas about food, it all came from women, So the next sentence to that thing is everything I learned about competition, I learned from a man. And when I remember when I started cooking in restaurants, right, there was all men. And we never sat around and talked about the beautiful floral nature of this peach. It was all about like, get this shit done and get it, done in the walk-in. And so I think as a successful chef, you need both. But it's definitely, there's a romance and a beauty and just this ephemeral thing about food that you don't get in professional kitchens very often because it's so much a business and it's so much about the grind. And I didn't grow up with that. I grew up, in a family who we cooked together and we ate together.
Well, I got to have a little peek. Everybody got to have a little peek of you cooking with your mom in the season opener of season 3 of Mind of a Chef. What a juggernaut that must have been for you.
Yeah, actually the section with my mom was the most stressful because she's like the X Factor. I had no idea what she was gonna do because she didn't listen to me. Like she doesn't listen to anyone. So she, it was just hilarious. But that was the most stressful part because I was like, I don't know if she's even gonna listen to anything anyone says.
It was adorable. I really loved it because I loved watching you defer again and again and again. I was almost waiting for you to say, okay, Mommy, and sit down. I felt like, okay, Mommy was coming.
It's funny that mothers still have that kind of power over their sons. It doesn't matter how old you are. Like, I'm still... And also she, like, afterwards, she came to the screening, right? We were in New York, and she came to the screening. And she actually told me, she was like, I was better than you on TV. She said that to me. To the
Thanks,
point where
Mom.
she's like, I should have my own show. I'm like, how do you even come to this?
That's wonderful.
Yeah, that's mothers.
Oh, that is so delightful. How did Mind of a Chef change your life in any way?
Yes and no. I mean, obviously, it really, it's great exposure, and just the experience is just mind blowing, and that show has got some incredibly loyal fans, and they come out to see me. So, and it was the experience overall was so amazing. And then at the same time, I'm still who I am, and I was still cooking the food that I did before the show and after. So, in some ways, it helps with the exposure. But as a chef, I'm still growing and expanding. I'm still learning all the time.
Well, it was a wonderful thing for everybody. We all loved it. And
Thank you.
I just feel that I have learned so much about you reading your new book, and some of the things you think about fascinate me. Mm-hmm. And I have to admit that as a New Orleanian, I don't have a lot of Korean American friends.
Mm-hmm. Well, you do now.
Well, the concept of sadness being passed through your DNA was very enchanting to me to think about. Would you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah. There's something about being Korean, and I would say about any sort of peoples or cultures that have been oppressed for a long, long time. That there's something like when I meet another Korean person, doesn't matter where they came from. Like we generally can trace our ancestry and our sort of life experiences back to a similar place. And just like my mom is like this kind of strong-willed, domineering person, like most Korean mothers are the same, And so whenever I meet them, I'm like, is your mom like that? They're like, yeah, my mom's like that. And it's very familial. But at the same time, like Korea had a very, very really brutally oppressive history for the last 100 years, really, and just post-Korean War, where they sort of been able to climb out of that. And so, like my parents and my I never knew my grandfather because he died before I was born, but my grandmother was a widow, and did all the hardships. They tell the story of my grandmother who took her son, which is my dad, wrapped when he was just a child, wrapped him up and got on a boat with 200 other people that she'd never met to escape the bombing in Seoul, and just stuff like that. I think that stuff gets passed on generation after generation, and some of it is narrative. But the other part, like if you ask most Koreans, they don't talk about it. It's not something that, culturally you just don't talk about. So I actually don't know a lot about it. But I still understand and I still feel the sort of pain in some kind of distant way, and I do believe there is some of that stuff gets passed on. Maybe I'm not a scientist, so I don't know if it's truly through DNA, but I do think it gets passed on.
I enjoyed the concept, and I'm curious. We've had so much of the mama talk. Is there a single dish? Is there a single scent or a flavor that just slams your mama in your face to you? What is the thing that brings her to you?
So there's two things. I would say really it's my grandmother who's flavor, because she is the person I associated with the kitchen more. My mother, and if she's listening, she's going to kill me. But she's not the best cook in the world because she was always working, and it's only recently that she started to actually cook. And it's part of where our relationship has really blossomed because both my mom and my dad worked full-time jobs 7 days a week, and so it was my grandmother who I associated with the kitchen and with cooking, and she would make her thing was making stews. She would make stews all day, and so anytime I smell like a miso-based stew, something with spice, or she would use like fish, all those guts, like oxtails and fish heads and anything that you could find for cheap, and throw like fermented chilies and miso and all that stuff. That anytime I smell that Asian peasant kind of flavor, it just brings me back. But my mother never cooked, right? Because she was working. And so, after my dad died and after, my grandma died and way after like I've been cooking, she had some free time. And she said, I'm going to, I really feel like it's something interesting because she was like, well, I'm going to cook now. She didn't have to. But she's like, I'm going to start to cook. And she's cooking all this Korean food as well as other stuff. And so I feel like in some ways, as sons to mothers, you sort of lose touch with your parents, right? Like you get busy and they're retired and you just don't have anything to talk about. And it's funny that somehow through food, like she'll just call me up and be like, hey, what's that recipe? And we're talking about food, but really we're talking about each other, But we use food as a conduit to sort of keep in touch with each other. And so it's been really nice to sort of have this second chance at a relationship with my mom in a way, but all the way just through food.
There are a lot of very personal stories that you tell. And I love that because to me, when you're genuine and personal, and you let people into intimate parts of your life, it can potentially change everyone's life experience.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to really.
Oh, really? Okay.
It was a very awkward moment. So I'll precursor this with, I'm a chef. I'm not a professional writer, though I do love to write, and I've done some writing, and when I was writing this book, no one saw it. It was just me in a room with a typewriter a laptop and my editor. And so it was very, and my editor only would see it in chunks. And I had a writing coach, a really wonderful professor at Vassar. And he would just so it was really just like the three of us. And it never occurred to me, like some of these things, I was so in sort of in that space that I would just write the things that I thought made sense to me at the time. Never really looking at it from afar. And when I got done and I saw the whole manuscript, and there was a moment when I actually realized that this was going to go out into the world. Mm-hmm. And I said, I don't know if I really want all this. Like I wrote it, I know I wrote it, but I don't know if I really want all this stuff out there. And my publisher was like, "Well, it's too late. it's already done." And I'm glad she did. But I really had second doubts. I had second thoughts on it because at the moment when you're writing it, you don't think about the fact that someone's going to read it. That sounds weird, but I was just writing it almost, sometimes it was almost therapy, I guess. It was just,
We're food people.
Yeah.
And so that makes us a special breed. And there is a fine food thread that runs through your book. Even when you're reflecting on your dad's death, which you somehow managed to tie into aquavit and pickled salmon. And I was amazed to read it. I was fascinated by the detachment that you displayed. And frankly, I couldn't wait to make the pickled salmon.
Oh, good. It's a fun dish.
But Dad's death is never a fun topic.
No, and as you know, like I was explaining this to someone at a book signing the other day. I see everything through the lens of food, So like literally everything. I was at this big event and this caterer, and everyone's dressed in these beautiful gowns and they're doing all this. And I'm like, I'm worried about the caterer putting out 600 plates of food at the same time, right? Like I see everything in food, and so even something as personal and as detached as, a father's death, I still somehow see it through a lens of food. And see it through the time and what I was doing at the time, which I was actually on book tour and eating my way through Seattle when that happened. And so it just in some ways it's natural for me and comforting that even in all these times there's always food. There's always food around everywhere. And so it just gives me something to attach myself to.
Anybody who knows me knows that if you want to make me happy, just butter me up.
Okay.
And I was really fascinated by the story of smen. Tell us about that ingredient smen, S-M-E-N, for the uninitiated, which I was until I read about it.
And so is I. And what's interesting is if you look online, there's very little literature on it, and there's very little. Like I always find it fascinating that in this day and age with the internet and everything, like we think we know everything. We really think all you got to do is put it in Google and you find it. And it's fascinating that something like this, you put it in Google. There's not a lot out there, maybe now, but there's not a lot out there. But I'd kind of heard this thing, like 'cause one of the first jobs I had was at a French Moroccan restaurant, and they had hired some Moroccan, a man and a woman, a couple, to be the consultant chefs, and they were straight from Morocco, and they were only here with us for a month, and they kind of consulted. And I remember him at some point talking about SMIM. And it was funny because he was also like, all this food that we're teaching you is just kind of tourist food. And I was like, I don't understand. And,
like, thanks.
I
thought I was learning something good.
And his thing was that he was like, yeah, if it's fun, you get the recipes, but real Moroccan food, we grind spices to order. We grind spices that morning. Like if you really want Moroccan food, it's not about the recipe. It's about the spices. It's about how fresh it is, and it's about fermenting your own butter. And I was like, well, I don't know, what is that? Anyway, this was way before the internet, and so like it was way before cell phones. I remember like I had written all this stuff in a piece of paper and I lost it, and so years go by, and I don't know how, but I was kind of introduced to it again, and I was like, I need to find out what this thing is that apparently is prevalent all over Morocco. And yet we know so little about it over here. And so I had heard about this woman that was doing these legendary dinner parties in Connecticut, in this very like ritzy sort of, suburban Connecticut town. And I was like, that just sounds weird. So I, made a few phone calls, made a few emails. Anyway, I got invited to her home, and she let me come in. And I said, do you know this thing called SMIM? And she said, yeah. She said, I have a jar from 10 years ago right now in my cabinet. And I was like, I have to come to your house. And she let me come over, and we cooked, and we made the fermented butter together. And in fact, I just had, so for the writing of this book, it was almost 2 years ago now, or a year and a half ago. And I still have the jar that we made together. And I tasted it recently, and it's fantastic. And so it's this, and I want to keep it forever. But
well, the FDA is never going to allow us to have this commercially. I'm sure.
I don't think so.
30 and the real prize is the 30-year-old SMIM that's from like grandmother or something in the back of the cupboard for 30 years.
Which, can you imagine having like a butter at room temperature? Sitting out there for 30 years, like what that must taste like is fascinating to me. So like literally I have this jar, and it's a year and a half, and it's sitting in my cupboard at home, and it's already pretty funky. And I'm just thinking like, it's like wine, right? It's like what happens to it all? It's fascinating to me. But people keep wine for 30 years. Why not butter?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I am fascinated, and I can't wait to have some. And I was also very grateful that in the book you describe the process of bourbon washing butter. And I've had cocktails that have had butter washed bourbon, and again I've thought, what the heck are they talking about?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Now, you mentioned, we're talking about fermentation, and I'm curious, do you think that fermentation, maybe it's because of kimchi that it's just in your blood, and that is why fermentation is such a point of fascination for you?
I do, actually. I do. And not only that, but like miso and gochujang and all the things that I grew up with. But what's fascinating to me is that every culture that I sort of come into contact with, if you go back far enough, every culture has a history of fermentation, whether it's, prosciutto or cured hams or in South America, they have all these like cured fish and all these things. all of our cultural diets, if you trace it back far enough, we needed fermented products to survive. We needed fermented products for our health. And so we've come to an age where we think we don't need them anymore because we have refrigeration and we have all this stuff, and we don't need to ferment products in order for them to last very long, right? But I think, and again, I'm no scientist, but I think what we're discovering is that all these fermented products are actually really good for our health. And it's really good for our gut, and that we not, there's a theory that like when something tastes really, really delicious to you, it's because your body needs it and craves it. Listen, I like pizza and all that, but like when I'm really like feeling down, like there's nothing that gets me going than like a bowl of like kimchi, and I think it's stuff that your body just craves because you need it. And what's interesting here in America is that we're just kind of waking up right now to this idea of fermented foods, but it's catching on like wildfire, and I think it is because it's like our bodies are just craving it, and for a couple of decades through this whole sort of, industrial commercialization of food, we got rid of all our fermented products, right? Because they were dirty and we didn't need them. Everything's canned, and now, I believe it's a generation of unhealthy people that just ate out of cans and TV dinners and fast food restaurants, and now we're going, my goodness, like our bodies want this, we need it, and not only tastes good, but it makes us feel better.
Well, I'm sitting here looking at you and thinking about the things you write about, the things you're fascinated about, and you're obviously very drawn to immigrants, assimilation, and the immigrant experience in America. And I can only imagine that you have had a very fascinating life because you're Korean American, but maybe you could pass for all sorts of different ethnicities, perhaps. Do you want to talk about that and what inspires you and fuels that exploration?
Yeah, and then, it's funny. It's not. When I started doing this project, and I started traveling to all these cities around the world. Around the country. And again, looking at it from a food lens, what, and I pose this question to you as I do to everyone, like, what thread binds us together as Americans in terms of our food, right? Because the way you eat in New Orleans versus the way someone eats in Seattle or someone eats in Southern California or the Midwest, it's so different. There's and there's almost no continuity. There's almost nothing. And it always makes me think, like, what is it about it? Like if you go to Italy, there's some sort of chain that binds it all together. France or Asia or, South America. And I look at America and I look at it's all of its, vastness. And I look at all the different layers and I go, I don't know what binds us as Americans, what holds us together as Americans in the food space. But then you take it to another level and go, what makes us Americans? And I think that's the ultimate question. And the ultimate question for me is, in that vast sort of definition of America, where's my place in it? Where do I belong in it as this immigrant of Korean kids who grew up in Brooklyn but cooks Southern food and lives in the South, but doesn't quite belong in the South, but in part of the South. And, and I think all of us are just looking for our place in this world. And when it comes to a culinary or cultural landscape in America, like, where do I fit in? And I don't have the answer for that, but one of the things that I did realize was in writing this book, like, it's our diversity that is the only thing that I can really say that's truly American is our diversity, right? I spent a week in Italy like a couple of years ago because my friend got married there, so I had to spend a week in the same town, and it was the region where I can't remember the name. It was the region where they make pesto, and for the first 2 days I was in heaven because I was like, this is the best. It was amazing, and by the third day I was like, does anyone know a Chinese restaurant in this town? Because I'm kind of sick of pesto. And by the fourth day, I was just like, I can't eat another bite of this thing. And I just wanted anything. But there, they never get sick of it. There, they don't want anything else. They go, and I was like, can I just even get like a spicy red sauce? They were like, we don't. We make pesto.
We make pesto.
And we make seafood pasta, but we don't put lemon in it because it's not lemons don't grow here, and just that kind of very strict traditionalism, which is fine for that part of Italy, would never fly here because we demand diversity. We want diversity in our food. We want to wake up and eat fried chicken and have an Indian food for lunch and have hummus for dinner. And that's not even weird. But it's something...
Because we're American.
Because we're American. But it's something that in any other country would be such a luxury, would be such a weird thing because you don't do that. You don't eat outside of your class or your race or your whatever it is. And here, that's the one thing that I can find about this country that we can all agree on is that we like our food, and we like our food to be very different. We want choices and we want diversity. And so if we just take that as a starting point, then we can, see it through all the other circles of culture and be like, of course, where would we be without immigrants and their food and their
wouldn't
cultures?
be.
Yeah.
We just wouldn't be. And I'm so glad that you talked about being in Italy and saying, where's the Chinese restaurant? Because I get the sense that is your go-to thing. When you're exploring almost anything, anywhere, you inevitably seem to ask, where's the Chinese restaurant?
They're everywhere.
It's incredible. And what I would like to bring this whole conversation back to about Asian food and Southern food is I would like you to take us all to the Hibachi Buffet in Clarksdale, Mississippi, where you can get sushi, fried foods, salad, and soul food. And in the kitchen, somehow, there's a Chinese man, a young Mexican, and an African-American woman. So where do you find the sensibilities and all that? And what the heck were you doing at the Hibachi Buffet?
And it's funny, and it's a Japanese name. There's not a single Japanese person in the whole place. It's funny because I was in Clarksdale, right? And then everyone that was a foodie, right, was like, don't go there. It's not, and it wasn't something that I would go like, oh my God. But to me, that restaurant and how they existed was so symbolic. It was like a microcosm of America to me. That is so American, and that you have these people, and what we do here in this country is we coexist with each other. And sometimes that existence is not happy. Sometimes it's very tense. Sometimes it's violent. Sometimes it's harmonious. Sometimes it's wonderful. But we just sit here and we are so many different people. It's like a big soup. And every generation, we just keep throwing ingredients in it. And sometimes the soup is not very good. And sometimes the soup needs improvements. But sometimes it's fabulous. And we just keep throwing it. And it's never going to end. It's never going to be finished. It's the recipe that has no finish. But that's what we are. And it's messy. And but it's also like we own it. It's who we are, And it's not pleasant sometimes. And it's not very neat and doesn't have closure, but that's who we are, and I think the sooner that we embrace that, both in its food and the cultural implications, we can start to sort of understand like these differences are our strength as well.
Well, Edward, I can tell you that I'm ready to have some of that soup you're working on any old time. So thank you for introducing us to that concept of that great American soup.
Thank you.
And please have me over for a bowl sometime.
I will. But you may have to come up to Louisville, Kentucky, and I'll cook for you anytime.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Cheers.